As you know, the right wing of the Republican Party is at odds with the establishment, and that is certainly nothing new. This current battle has been going on at least since the Tea Party emerged soon after President Obama moved into the White House. But this division has roots that go back generations, and that is the focus of a new book by Washington Post opinion writer E.J Dionne. E.J, your book, Why the Right Went Wrong, seems perfectly timed for the dysfunction we've seen in this presidential cycle, but you were clearly working on this long before those fissures became obvious to the rest of us. What trouble did you see on the right that led you to pen this book, and what did you see before the rest of us did?
Well, thank you for putting it that way. I appreciate that very much. I think there were several things that you could see for a long time. The first was really expressed in the first sentence of my book, that the history of contemporary American conservatism is a story of disappointment and betrayal. And what I argue is that ever since Barry Goldwater's campaign pushed the Republican Party to the right, conservative politicians have had to make a series of promises they couldn't keep. They promised a smaller government that they couldn't bring about. Even Ronald Reagan couldn't do it. Government was about the same size as the share of the economy at the end of his term as it was at the beginning. They promised to roll back the cultural changes of the 1960s, and really the country didn't want to turn back from the progress we'd made in many fronts. And of late, they promised to virtually change the ethnic makeup of the country, and obviously that cannot be accomplished unless you are willing to join Donald Trump in deporting 11 million people. But by making a series of promises like this, conservatives continually disappointed their own base and radicalized them. And so you started seeing rank-and-file conservatives increasingly frustrated with their own leadership. Second, the Republican Party had for years gotten the votes of white working-class voters in election after election and really didn't deliver any material benefits to them. And over time, they became frustrated. And in a lot of ways, Donald Trump's campaign is the revenge of these kind of voters. They are the base of Trump's support. You have the odd experience of a billionaire, or at least we think he's a billionaire, leading a class war inside the Republican Party. The last point I'd make quickly is moderate candidates can't win in the Republican Party because so many moderates have defected from the Republicans over the last 25 years as they move right. So I think sort of these three factors help lead us to where we are today, and so Trump shouldn't have surprised us as much as he did.
You make the split in the conservative movement sound like something of a self-perpetuating process. I make a promise that I can't keep. The party moves further to the right, which leads to more promises that can't be kept. Did anybody try to put the brakes on that process? Did anybody sense that was happening as it was happening?
Yeah, and you saw that a couple of times. In a way, both Bush presidencies tried and failed to sort of halt the process. In the case of the first President Bush, he knew there were corrections in Reaganism that needed to happen. And, you know, he became the environmental president. He actually passed some strong environmental legislation. And he began the process of education reform. Even Ronald Reagan himself tried to pull the party back at various points. And then George W. Bush began with a kind of reform effort that he essentially gave up on, partly because of 9/11. But compassionate conservatism began as an effort to kind of pull the party back from this. But it didn't ever gain real traction in the party, and it never became a central theme of the Bush presidency. And by the end of the Bush presidency, conservatives kind of were Bush ended up with the worst of all possible worlds, George W. did. The liberals didn't trust him. Obviously, they were against the Iraq War, against his tax cuts. But conservatives were criticizing him as a big government conservative, even if most of that spending was in Baghdad, not Buffalo. And so to the extent that there have been efforts to pull the party back, so far they have failed.
You mentioned Ronald Reagan, and obviously there's a lot of reflection on Reagan given the passing of Nancy Reagan. You write in the book that his legacy is a difficult one for Republicans to process. I'm curious if you could explain a little bit more on that, and whether there's a recognition that Reagan probably wouldn't be electable in today's Republican Party.
Yeah, there are a lot of positions he took that would make it difficult for him. Everybody forgets that after he cut taxes sharply, he agreed to a series of tax increases including a tax increase to help save the Social Security program that he, earlier in his political career, had opposed. He was under a lot of criticism from the right back in the day for not being willing to commit American troops abroad. The only war he actually fought directly was against Grenada, where the army had 110 people in it. In Lebanon, he pulled the troops out. Reagan was an ambiguous figure. I did a lot of interviews with conservatives for this book, and Charles Krauthammer put it well, the conservative commentator. He said, you can choose your Reagan. You can look at Reagan, the movement builder, who really was an ideologue, and that's whom the right wing of the party looks to. Or you can look to Reagan as the guy who was willing to compromise with people like Tip O'Neill. And so it's a very ambiguous legacy that he left. I think the other point is constantly saying we got to go back to Reagan doesn't work any more than it would work for Democrats to say we got to go back to Franklin Roosevelt. Obviously, Democrats and liberals revere Roosevelt's memory. I certainly do. And conservatives can revere Reagan's memory. But there are new and different problems right now. And the younger conservatives are the ones who are saying, you know, we've got to move beyond this. And I think eventually that's going to happen.
Have to ask you, while we've got you here, your take on Donald Trump and Ted Cruz, both their individual campaigns and also as the potential figureheads of the Republican Party, and at least for Cruz's standpoint, perhaps the conservative movement.
Right. I think that, you know, in this campaign, you're seeing that the effort to kind of hold the old conservative formula together was probably best represented by Marco Rubio, who tried to be a little bit of everything to every kind of conservative and therefore was never able to build a base. You know, Ted Cruz is the hard conservative ideologue, unapologetic about it. Donald Trump goes kind of right and left at the same time. He's farther right than anyone on immigration in the often outlandish things he's willing to say about Muslims. And yet on certain economic issues, he says he won't cut Social Security and Medicare. He wants to negotiate prescription drug prices. He is a real critic of free trade. I think they're both a different kind of threat to the conservative movement. I think it might be useful for the Republicans to nominate Cruz so that the right wing of the party could have a real test of this ideology. And either they win or they lose, and I think that would force the kind of reassessment that I think conservatives need to make. I think they could face a real catastrophe if they nominated Trump, and that also, I hope, would bring about this day of reckoning. One of the heroes in my book is Dwight Eisenhower. As someone who was a real conservative. He was a budget balancer. He was sympathetic to religion. He really wanted to preserve the American way of life, but he accepted that certain changes over time become part of that way of life. He was more like an Edmund Burke conservative than a reactionary, and I think that spirit needs to sort of reappear on the right. And obviously, you can't go back to Eisenhower any more than you can go back to Reagan or Roosevelt, but I think there's a spirit there that conservatives have to start thinking about again.
Finally, E.J., you know as well as I do that there are going to be liberals and Democrats who look at the split in the Republican Party and the conservative movement with a certain amount of glee. You argue in the book that it's important that a functioning GOP for the benefit of the nation. What are those smiling liberals today missing from that thesis?
Well, I get that, and at times, you know, there is some satisfaction in seeing that something that you knew wasn't going to work finally stops working, and I get that part of it. But I think that a functioning democratic system needs a responsible and reasonable form of conservatism. I mean, obviously, you know, I'm a liberal and unapologetic about it, but not everything we propose works. We need critics, just like they need critics. I think conservatives are right to have us think about tradition. Sometimes tradition needs to be overturned. Sometimes traditions support oppression. But tradition should be overturned lightly. And I think conservatives also preach that human nature is not something you can just change with government action. And while you can create conditions in which beings may behave better, I think they're right about that. So I want a healthier system where we don't have so much gridlock. where we can begin to compromise again and where we can have a genuine exchange of ideas. Right now, we are so dug into our corners that we can hardly talk to each other anymore, and I don't think that is very healthy for a functioning democracy over the long run.
E.J Dionne, author of Why the Right Went Wrong, Conservatism from Goldwater to the Tea Party and Beyond. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
It's so good to be with you. Thank you.
Wondering what's going on up in the Hudson Valley? Don't worry, your headlines are next.